She arrived with her mother, and the cowboy opened his door to both. The woman at the end of the train. The train pulled into Silver Creek just before sunset, its whistle echoing across the wide New Mexico plains like a lonely cry searching for an answer. Daniel Hayes stood near the wooden platform, hat low over his brow, boots dusty from a long day riding fence lines. He wasn't a man who waited for much in life. Not for fortune, not for luck, and certainly not for love. But today was different. Today, a woman was arriving, a woman he had never met, only written to. A mail-order bride. The townsfolk had gathered, pretending not to stare. Silver Creek was small, and strangers were rare. A bride arriving by train was an event. Daniel shifted his weight as steam wrapped around the iron wheels. His heart thudded harder than it had during any cattle drive. He had imagined her 100 times. Young, frightened, hopeful. He hadn't imagined what stepped off the train. First came a young woman in a simple blue dress, her posture straight despite obvious nerves. Her dark hair was pinned neatly at the back of her head. She scanned the platform with searching eyes, intelligent, cautious eyes. And then, behind her, slower, trembling, an elderly woman, thin shoulders wrapped in a worn gray shawl, hair white as winter frost, one hand gripping a small carpetbag, the other clutching the young woman's arm for balance. The platform fell silent. Daniel felt his breath stall. The young woman stepped forward. "Mr. Hayes?" she asked softly. Her voice wasn't weak. It carried quiet strength. "That's me," Daniel replied. She swallowed. "My name is Margaret Sullivan." She hesitated, then glanced back at the frail woman beside her. "And this is my mother." Whispers rippled through the crowd. Daniel heard someone mutter, "Didn't sign up for that." Margaret's chin lifted slightly, a silent shield against humiliation. Daniel noticed everything in that moment. The exhaustion in her face. The protectiveness in her posture. The fear she tried so hard to hide. He could walk away. No contract had been signed. No vows spoken. He could tell her this wasn't what he agreed to. Margaret seemed ready for that answer. She straightened her shoulders, bracing for rejection. Daniel looked at the elderly woman. She was shaking, not just from age, but from shame. And something inside him shifted. He stepped forward, taking the carpetbag gently from the old woman's hand. "Well," he said calmly, "my home's got 2 extra chairs at the table." Margaret blinked. Daniel met her gaze fully now. "My house has room for both." The crowd fell into stunned silence. Margaret's lips trembled. Her mother looked up at him, eyes glistening with gratitude she was too proud to voice. And just like that, Daniel Hayes chose a life he hadn't planned for. The wagon ride back to his ranch was quiet. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in amber and rose. Margaret sat beside her mother in the back, holding her steady whenever the wheels hit rough ground. Daniel stole a glance over his shoulder. "You don't have to explain," he said gently. Margaret hesitated. "I wrote to you about my situation," she replied. "You wrote your mother was unwell." "Yes, but you didn't say she'd be coming." Margaret lowered her eyes. No man would have agreed. Daniel nodded slowly. "She was right. Most wouldn't. I couldn't leave her behind," Margaret continued. "There's no one else." Silence settled between them again. Then Daniel said something that surprised even himself. "Family's not something you leave behind." Margaret looked up sharply. There was no judgment in his voice. Only certainty. For the first time since stepping off that train, hope flickered in her eyes. Daniel's ranch wasn't grand. A modest wooden house. A red barn. Miles of open land rolling into the horizon. But it was steady. Solid. Honest. He helped Margaret's mother down carefully. "What should I call you, ma'am?" he asked. "Eleanor," the old woman replied softly. "Well, Miss Eleanor," Daniel said, offering his arm, "let's get you inside." Margaret watched him, confusion mixing with gratitude. He wasn't pretending. He wasn't resentful. He was kind. Inside, Margaret took in the home. Clean floors, a sturdy table, fresh bread cooling near the stove. "You baked?" she asked, surprised. Daniel shrugged slightly. "Figured you might be tired from travel." Margaret felt her throat tighten. No one had prepared anything for them in a very long time. That first night, Margaret lay awake long after her mother had fallen asleep in the small spare room. She stared at the ceiling beams. She had come expecting obligation. Perhaps tolerance. She had not expected warmth. Daniel sat outside on the porch, staring at the stars. What had he done? He had planned for partnership, not responsibility for an ailing woman. Not medical bills, not fragile health, not extra worry, but when he pictured Eleanor standing alone on that platform, there had never really been a choice. Inside the house, Margaret whispered a quiet prayer. Outside, Daniel removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair. Two strangers under one roof. Bound not by love, but by mercy. And sometimes, mercy is where love begins. The next morning brought reality. Eleanor coughed through breakfast. Margaret tried to hide how serious it sounded. Daniel noticed anyway. "I'll ride into town later," he said. "See what the doctor says." Margaret's fork froze midair. "You would do that?" "Course I would." She looked at him carefully. "You don't owe us that." Daniel met her gaze steadily. "If you're staying here, then I reckon we look after each other." Something unspoken passed between them. Not romance. Not yet. But respect, and the fragile beginning of trust. Later that afternoon, Daniel returned with medicine and broth supplies. Margaret stood in the doorway when he arrived. "You didn't have to spend money on us." Daniel handed her the parcels. "Didn't spend it on you. Spent it on family." The word lingered in the air between them. Family. Margaret hadn't felt that word applied to her in years. Eleanor watched from her chair by the window, a knowing smile faint on her lips. She saw what her daughter could not yet see. Kindness like Daniel's was rare. And it was real. Days turned into weeks. Margaret proved herself capable. She mended clothes, cooked warm meals, tended a small garden patch beside the house. Daniel found himself lingering longer at the dinner table, listening to her stories of the East, watching the way she brushed Eleanor's hair with gentle hands, noticing how she never complained. One evening, a storm rolled across the plains. Thunder cracked violently overhead. Eleanor grew frightened. Margaret knelt beside her mother's bed, whispering comfort. Daniel stood in the doorway. "You're safe here," he said quietly. Margaret looked at him in the dim lantern light. For the first time, she smiled without hesitation. "I think we are." Outside, lightning split the sky. Inside, three hearts began stitching themselves into something stronger than arrangement. Something steadier than expectation. Something neither of them had dared to hope for. And though none of them knew it yet, that train platform moment was the beginning of a love story that would stretch far beyond obligation, far beyond duty, into something lasting. Whispers in Silver Creek. The first sign of trouble didn't come from the sky or the land. It came from people. Silver Creek had always been a town that noticed everything. And when something didn't fit their idea of proper, they noticed that even more. Daniel heard the whispers before he saw the stairs. He had ridden into town early that Saturday morning to collect feed and pick up Eleanor's medicine. The general store bell jingled as he stepped inside. Conversation stopped. Not completely. Just enough. "Well, if it ain't Daniel Hayes, Mr. Parker drawled from behind the counter. "How's the new arrangement?" Daniel set a coin pouch on the counter calmly. "It's not an arrangement. It's my household." A few men chuckled near the stove. "Didn't know you were running a boarding house now," someone muttered. Daniel didn't rise to it. He signed for the supplies, gathered the medicine bottle carefully, and left without another word. But the tension followed him. Outside, two women stood near the water pump. "That's her," one whispered as Margaret stepped down from the mercantile porch across the street. carrying flour and sugar in a small sack. Margaret felt the weight of their eyes. She kept her posture straight. She had endured worse than whispers. Still, they stung. When Daniel reached her, he noticed the tightness in her expression. "You all right?" he asked quietly. "I am," she replied. "I've learned that people often fear what they don't understand." Daniel studied her for a moment. "You ain't done nothing wrong." Margaret gave him a small smile. "Neither have you." But Silver Creek wasn't done testing them. That evening, Reverend Collins paid a visit. Daniel opened the door to find the older man standing stiffly on the porch. "Evening, Daniel," he said. "May I come in?" Margaret was at the stove. Eleanor sat by the window with her knitting. Daniel nodded. "Of course, Reverend." The air inside shifted as the preacher removed his hat. "I've heard some talk," he began carefully. "Concern, mostly." "Concern about what?" Daniel asked. Reverend Collins cleared his throat. "A man bringing a woman into his home without proper vows. An elderly mother besides. The town worries about appearances." Margaret froze. Daniel stepped forward slightly, placing himself between Margaret and the conversation. "We're not living in sin," he said evenly. "We're living with decency." The Reverend's eyes softened slightly. "Then perhaps it would ease minds if you made it official." Margaret's breath caught. A wedding? They had barely known each other a month. Daniel glanced at her. He saw fear there. Not fear of marriage. Fear of obligation. Of being unwanted. After a long silence, Daniel answered. "When Margaret feels ready, we'll decide that together." The Reverend studied him for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "I'll pray for your wisdom." When the door closed behind him, the house felt heavier. Margaret turned to Daniel. "You don't owe me marriage to quiet gossip." Daniel looked at her, really looked at her. "I wouldn't marry you to quiet gossip." Silence lingered. "Then why would you?" she asked softly. Daniel hesitated. "Because every day you're here, this house feels less empty." Margaret's heart stumbled at the honesty in his voice. Eleanor watched from her chair, eyes glistening quietly. The real test came a week later. Eleanor collapsed. Margaret had been hanging laundry when she heard the thud inside the house. She rushed in to find her mother pale and trembling on the floor. "Daniel," she cried. He was in the barn and came running at the sound of her panic. Together they lifted Eleanor carefully onto the bed. Her breathing was shallow. Daniel didn't hesitate. "I'll ride for the doctor." "It's nearly dark," Margaret said, fear gripping her voice. "Then I'll ride faster." He saddled his horse in record time and disappeared into the fading light. Margaret knelt beside her mother's bed, tears finally spilling freely. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I shouldn't have brought you here. I shouldn't have burdened him." Eleanor reached weakly for her hand. "You chose love," she whispered. "That is never a burden." Hours passed before Daniel returned, the doctor riding behind him. Through the night, Daniel kept the fire burning and boiled water as instructed. He never once complained, never once showed regret. When dawn finally crept through the window, the doctor gave a tired nod. "She'll pull through, but she needs rest and care." Daniel exhaled deeply. Margaret turned to him, eyes red but shining. "You saved her." Daniel shook his head. "We saved her." That word again. We. Something shifted permanently that night. But hardship rarely arrives alone. 2 days later, a rancher named Caleb Turner rode onto Daniel's land without invitation. Caleb had always believed he deserved more than he had, including Margaret. He dismounted slowly, eyeing the house. "So it's true," he said coldly. "You brought a woman here who ain't even your wife." Daniel stepped onto the porch. "State your business." Caleb smirked. "Town says you're playing house. I say she deserves better." Margaret stepped outside before Daniel could stop her. "I am not something to be claimed," she said firmly. Caleb looked surprised by her strength. Daniel's jaw tightened. "She's under my protection," he said quietly. Caleb laughed. "Protection, or possession?" Before Daniel could answer, Margaret did. I chose to stay. Her voice didn't waver. I chose this home. Caleb's expression darkened. You'll regret it. Daniel took one step forward. Ride off. And something in his tone made Caleb listen. He mounted his horse and left, dust trailing behind him like a warning. That evening, Margaret sat beside Daniel on the porch for the first time. The sky stretched white above them, painted in deep purples and gold. I don't want to cause you trouble, she said. You're not trouble, but men like Caleb, I've handled worse. She studied his profile. You don't ever seem afraid. Daniel chuckled softly. I'm afraid plenty. Of what? He looked at her then. Losing what matters. The wind moved gently through her hair. And what matters? She asked. He didn't look away. Your mother. This life we're building. Margaret felt her heart open in a way she hadn't allowed before. Not out of necessity, not out of gratitude, but out of something deeper. Trust. She reached for his hand, just barely. He didn't pull away, and under the vast western sky, their fingers intertwined for the first time. Not because of duty, not because of gossip, but because somewhere between a train platform and a stormy night, two guarded hearts had begun to choose each other. The fire on the horizon. The trouble didn't come with shouting. It came with smoke. Daniel saw it first, a thin, dark line rising against the pale morning sky while he was mending fence along the eastern ridge. At first, he thought it was a controlled burn from another ranch. But the wind shifted, and the smoke thickened, too thick, too close. His stomach tightened. The smoke was coming from his land. Daniel spurred his horse hard toward the house. By the time he crested the hill near the barn, flames were licking up the side of the hay shed. The dry summer air fed the fire greedily. Margaret was already outside, hauling buckets from the well. Eleanor stood near the porch, clutching her shawl, panic etched into her pale face. Daniel, Margaret cried, relief and fear colliding in her voice. Get your mother inside the house. He shouted. Close the shutters. Margaret hesitated only a second before running to Eleanor's side. Daniel worked fast, throwing water against the growing blaze, but the wind betrayed him. Sparks leapt toward the barn. If the barn caught, they would lose everything. Within minutes, neighbors began arriving. Not all of Silver Creek was cruel. Some still believed in helping hands over gossip. Mr. Alvarez brought his sons. 2 ranch hands from the North Ridge came with wet blankets. They formed a line, passing buckets, shouting orders. The fire roared like something alive, determined to devour Daniel's hard-built life. Margaret refused to stay inside. She joined the bucket line, skirts soaked, hair coming loose from its pins. Daniel saw her and felt a strange mixture of pride and terror. Stay back, he called. I will not, she answered fiercely. The flames reflected in her eyes, not fear, but defiance. After nearly an hour that felt like an eternity, the fire began to weaken. The shed was destroyed, the barn wall blackened and scarred. But the house still stood. The ranch still breathed. Daniel dropped to one knee, exhausted. Margaret rushed to him. You're burned, she whispered, seeing the red blister across his forearm. It's nothing, but she took his hand carefully anyway, leading him toward the house. Inside, Eleanor wept softly, not from weakness, but from relief. You saved our home, she murmured. Daniel shook his head. We saved it, again, we. But as the smoke cleared, another truth settled in. Fires don't start themselves on windless mornings. Daniel walked the perimeter once the flames were fully dead. Near the back fence, he found it. A broken lantern, oil spilled deliberately into dry brush. His jaw tightened. This was no accident, and he knew exactly who carried that kind of bitterness. That evening, the sheriff rode up. Sheriff Donnelly had served Silver Creek for 20 years. A fair man, a careful one. You suspect someone? He asked after Daniel showed him the lantern remains. Daniel hesitated. Caleb Turner's name sat heavy on his tongue. I don't accuse without proof, Daniel said finally. Sheriff Donnelly nodded slowly. But you have an idea. Daniel's eyes hardened. Yes. The sheriff glanced toward the house, where Margaret stood at the window. You planning to stay in town long-term with her? Daniel didn't hesitate this time. Yes. The answer surprised even him. It wasn't a defensive reply. It was certainty. Sheriff Donnelly studied him. Then be prepared. Men like Caleb don't like losing. That night, Margaret cleaned Daniel's burn gently with cool water and salve. Her hands were steady, but her heart wasn't. This is my fault, she whispered. Daniel looked at her sharply. No, if you hadn't come, he interrupted softly, this house would still be empty. She blinked back tears. I don't want you harmed because of me. Daniel reached for her wrist, stopping her movement. You are not a burden. You are not a mistake. And you are not something that happened to me. His voice lowered. You're something I chose. The words settled between them like something sacred. Margaret's breath trembled. Why? She asked honestly. Daniel searched for the answer. Because you're strong. Because you care for your mother without resentment. Because when the fire came, you didn't run. He paused. And because when you look at me, I feel like I'm more than just a man working land. Tears slid silently down her cheeks. She had never been chosen before. Only tolerated. Only endured. Daniel lifted his uninjured hand to her face, brushing away a tear with callous gentleness. Outside, the land still smelled faintly of smoke. Inside, something far stronger was taking root. The next morning, Caleb rode into town openly. Whispers followed him. Some said he had been seen near Daniel's land the night before the fire. But no one spoke directly. Cowardice often hides behind silence. Daniel walked into the saloon that afternoon, not to fight, but to stand. The room quieted instantly. Caleb leaned back in his chair. Come to accuse me, Hayes. Daniel's voice remained calm. I came to tell you something. Caleb smirked. You think you won something? Daniel stepped closer. I didn't win. I chose. Caleb's smile faded. I chose her. I chose her mother. I chose this life. The saloon held its breath. And if any man threatens that again, Daniel continued evenly, he won't find me standing quiet. It wasn't a threat shouted in anger. It was a promise spoken in resolve. Caleb stood slowly. For a moment, it seemed fists would fly. But then, Caleb laughed bitterly and stepped aside. This ain't over, he muttered. But something had changed. The town had heard Daniel's stance. And they had seen something rare. A man not driven by pride, but by protection. That evening, as sunset painted the plains gold again, Daniel returned home. Margaret stood waiting on the porch. You went to town, she said quietly. Yes. For him, yes. She stepped closer. I don't want violence. You won't have it. She searched his face. And if he doesn't stop. Daniel looked past her, toward the scarred barn wall. Then I'll stand stronger. Margaret took a slow breath. Then she did something neither of them had expected. She reached up and kissed him. Soft, brief, certain. Daniel froze, then responded gently, careful not to rush something sacred. When they pulled apart, the air felt different. No longer fragile, but firm. Inside, Eleanor watched through the window, a faint smile curving her tired lips. The fire had tested them. But instead of breaking apart, they had chosen each other more clearly than before. And sometimes, love isn't born in peace. Sometimes it's forged in flame. The question that changes everything. The fire left scars, not just on the barn wall, but on all of them. For days after, the scent of smoke lingered in the air like a reminder that peace could be taken in an instant. Daniel worked from sunrise to dusk repairing the damage. Margaret insisted on helping, even when her hands blistered from hauling lumber. You don't have to prove anything, Daniel told her one afternoon as she steadied a board. I'm not proving, she replied softly. I'm building. Those words stayed with him. That evening, Eleanor's cough worsened again. The doctor came, his expression more serious than before. She needs drier air, he said quietly. Less strain, less worry. Margaret sat beside her mother's bed long after the doctor left. I should take you back east, she whispered. Eleanor's frail hand tightened around hers. No, but, I will not spend my last days running, Eleanor said gently. I will spend them where there is kindness. Margaret's heart broke in silence. From the doorway, Daniel heard every word. And that night, he made a decision. 2 mornings later, Daniel rode into town before sunrise. He stopped at the small jeweler's counter inside the Mercantile, a modest display of simple gold bands kept beneath glass. Mr. Parker raised an eyebrow. Didn't think you were the marrying type. Daniel rested his palm on the counter. I wasn't. He pointed to a plain ring. No diamonds, no engraving, just solid gold. That one. When he returned home, Margaret was kneeling in the garden patch, sleeves rolled up, hands deep in soil. She looked up when she heard his boots on the porch. You're back early. Daniel didn't answer right away. He walked toward her slowly, heart pounding harder than it had the day she stepped off that train. Margaret, he said. Something in his tone made her stand. Yes. He removed his hat, not out of habit, out of reverence. I didn't bring you here for convenience. She blinked. I didn't open my door out of charity. Her breath caught. I did it, because something in me knew, you belonged here. Silence wrapped around them like the wide sky above. I don't know how long we're given, he continued. I don't know what men like Caleb might try next. I don't know how many more storms we'll face. He reached into his pocket. But I know this. He opened his hand, revealing the simple gold band resting in his palm. Margaret's hands flew to her mouth. I don't want you staying here because you feel safe, Daniel said. I want you staying because you choose me. Tears blurred her vision. Daniel, I can't promise riches, or ease, but I can promise you this home will always protect you. And I will always stand beside you. His voice softened. Margaret Sullivan, will you marry me? For a moment, she couldn't speak. All her life, decisions had been forced upon her. Responsibilities handed to her. Doors closed. And now, a door stood open, not out of pity, but love. You're not asking because of town gossip. She whispered. No, not because of my mother. No, then why? Daniel stepped closer. Because when you're not in a room, I feel it. Her tears fell freely now. And because when I imagine my future, you're in every part of it. She laughed through her tears. Yes, she breathed. Then stronger. Yes, Daniel, I will. He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that had never trembled branding cattle, but trembled now. When he pulled her into his arms, it wasn't rushed. It was certain, steady, earned. From the window, Eleanor watched, one hand pressed to her heart. Thank you, she whispered softly, whether to God or fate, she wasn't sure. They were married 2 weeks later beneath the wide New Mexico sky. The entire town came, even those who once whispered. Reverend Collins stood before them, voice steady as he spoke the vows. Daniel's were simple. I choose you. Margaret's voice trembled but did not break. I choose you. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Silver Creek erupted in applause. And for the first time since stepping off that train, Margaret felt not like an outsider, but like she belonged. But joy and sorrow often walk hand in hand. That night, after the celebration faded and lanterns burned low, Eleanor asked to sit outside. Daniel carried her chair onto the porch. Margaret wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. You look happy, Eleanor said gently. I am, Margaret replied, kneeling beside her. Eleanor studied Daniel standing nearby. You found a good man. I did. Eleanor's breathing was shallow now. I can rest, she whispered. Margaret's chest tightened. Rest, Mama. But as the stars brightened above them, Eleanor's hand slowly went still in Margaret's grasp. There was no struggle, no fear, only peace. Margaret felt it immediately. Mama, Daniel stepped forward. The silence answered. Margaret leaned her forehead against her mother's hand, grief pouring through her like a river breaking its banks. Daniel knelt beside her, wrapping his arms around her shoulders. She wept, not only from loss, but from gratitude. Eleanor had seen her daughter safe, loved, chosen, and that had been enough. They buried Eleanor on a small rise overlooking the ranch. Wildflowers grew there naturally, swaying in quiet grace. Margaret stood beside Daniel, fingers intertwined with his. She didn't die in fear, Margaret said softly. No, Daniel replied. She died knowing she wasn't alone. Daniel squeezed her hand. And neither are you. Margaret leaned into him, grief still sharp, but no longer crushing. Because now, she had someone who stood firm when the world shook. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel repaired the last of the fire-scorched boards. Margaret approached quietly. You could have walked away that day at the train, she said. Daniel looked at her. I could have, but you didn't. He brushed dust from his hands. No, he said gently. I didn't. Margaret wrapped her arms around him from behind, resting her cheek against his back. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by land still healing from fire and hearts still healing from loss, they understood something profound. Love is not born in perfect beginnings. It is built in hard choices, protected in hard seasons, and proven when walking away would be easier. But somewhere beyond their peaceful horizon, resentment was still smoldering, and Caleb Turner had not yet decided to let go. What a man stands for. Grief changes a home, even one filled with love. In the weeks after Eleanor's passing, the ranch felt quieter. Not empty, never empty, but softened by memory. Margaret still set 3 cups out at breakfast the first morning. She froze when she realized. Daniel gently removed the 3rd cup without a word. That was how he loved her, not loudly, but steadily. They visited Eleanor's grave every Sunday after church. Margaret would bring fresh wildflowers. Daniel would stand beside her in silence, hat over his heart. But while peace settled inside their home, outside it, something darker was gathering. Caleb Turner had lost more than pride. He had lost control. In town, people had begun speaking Daniel's name with respect. Good man, stood by her, did right. Those words were knives to Caleb. And wounded men can be dangerous. It happened at dusk. Margaret was alone. Daniel had ridden out to check a broken fence line near the south ridge. He promised he'd return before nightfall. The sky burned orange as she finished hanging laundry. Then she heard it. Hoofbeats. Fast. Too fast. Her heart began to pound. Caleb rode into the yard without slowing. She stood still. You shouldn't be here, she said firmly. Caleb dismounted slowly, eyes cold. You look different, he said. Married life suits you. Margaret didn't respond. Does he treat you like a queen? Caleb continued mockingly. You need to leave. He stepped closer. You think he can protect you forever? Margaret's voice did not shake. I don't need protecting from you. I need distance. That struck him harder than shouting ever could. Caleb grabbed her arm, not violently, but firmly enough to remind her he could. You had options, he hissed. You chose him. Yes, she said, without hesitation. Yes, I did. The sound of a gun cocking split the air. Let her go. Daniel's voice, low, deadly calm. Caleb froze. Daniel stood near the barn, revolver steady in his hand, not reckless, not wild. Certain. Caleb slowly released her. You going to shoot me over a woman? Caleb sneered. Daniel's jaw tightened. I'll defend my wife over anything. The word wife echoed across the yard like thunder. Margaret moved quickly toward Daniel's side. Caleb laughed bitterly. You think this town's big enough for both of us? Daniel didn't lower the gun. It is. And if it ain't? Daniel's eyes hardened. Then you ride. Silence stretched thin between them. Caleb searched Daniel's face, looking for doubt. There was none, only resolve, and something else. Peace. The kind of peace that comes when a man knows exactly what he stands for. Caleb stepped backward. "You're not worth prison," he muttered. He mounted his horse and rode off, not in triumph, but in defeat. The dust settled slowly behind him. Daniel lowered the revolver only when Caleb disappeared beyond the ridge. Margaret turned to him, breath shaky now that danger had passed. "You came back," she whispered. "I told you I would." Her hands trembled as she touched his chest. "I was afraid." "I know." He wrapped his arms around her tightly, not because she was weak, but because she mattered. The next morning, Caleb Turner left Silver Creek. Some said he sold his land. Others said he ran from shame. Daniel didn't care which. All that mattered was this. The threat was gone. Months passed. The barn was rebuilt stronger than before. The land yielded a good harvest. And one quiet morning, Margaret stood in the kitchen holding a small folded cloth in her hands, staring at it in disbelief. Daniel noticed her expression immediately. "What is it?" She looked up slowly. Tears filled her eyes. "I think," she swallowed, "I think we're going to have a baby." The world seemed to stop. Daniel didn't move at first. Then he crossed the room in 2 steps and lifted her off the ground, laughing, a deep, unguarded sound she had never heard before. "Are you sure?" She nodded, smiling through tears. "Yes." He pressed his forehead to hers. "We're going to be parents. Not just husband and wife. Not just 2 strangers who took a chance. But a family." That evening, they walked to Eleanor's grave together. Margaret placed her hand over her stomach. "I wish she could see this," she whispered. Daniel knelt, brushing dust from the headstone. "She does," he said quietly. The wind moved gently through the grass. For a moment, Margaret could almost feel her mother's presence, not in sorrow, but in blessing. Years later, when their son ran laughing across the same porch where Eleanor had taken her final breath, when their daughter planted flowers in the same garden Margaret once knelt in alone, when Silver Creek spoke of Daniel Hayes not as the man who took in a mail-order bride, but as the man who stood for his family, Margaret would sometimes remember that train platform. The fear, the whispers, the uncertainty, and she would look at Daniel, hair touched with gray now, eyes still steady, and smile. Because everything had begun with a simple choice. My home has room for both. He had meant her mother. But what he truly made room for was love. And love, when chosen boldly, builds something no fire can destroy. Make sure to like and subscribe for more story backquotes like this.